And thank you very much. I'm presenting this really on behalf of my co-authors, who you can see include Katerina and Jonas, and also Adrian Deutsch, a former student I supervised, and Abraham Kennan. And this is an exploratory study looking at Australian majority members, and already there's a few themes in this talk that kind of echo or relate to some of the earlier discussion. So that's really, really useful. Let's see if we can, here we are. Just some context to start with. And I shamelessly have images of cute Australian animals throughout all of my talks. And this is a black-footed rock wallaby, which is a very rare marsupial in Australia and very cute. But let me talk a bit more substantively about the Australian context. Australia is a colonial settler society, as many of you would know. About 30% of the population is born overseas, and now 51% of the population is either born overseas or has at least one parent born overseas. So in relation to that question about who is the majority, in this case, actually the majority are no longer the numerical majority in that sense, or at least the group that I have called majority Australians are not the numerical majority in the population. There are also about 3 to 3.5% of the population who identify as Indigenous or First Nations Australians. And I should have said at the beginning of my talk, I'm coming to you from Whadjuk Noongar Budja, that is the country or Budja of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. Perth is known as Boorloo in Noongar, in the Noongar language. So Australia is a highly multi-ethnic, multilingual context, although majority Australians are depressingly monolingual. And I feel ashamed that many people presenting today are presenting in maybe their second, third, or fourth language, and I'm also depressingly monolingual. We don't really know a lot about the acculturation orientations of majority Australians, but here we're defining majority Australians as those who are descended from the British colonisers largely. So they are predominantly white, and they hold economic, political and social power within the Australian context. As I said, we don't know a lot about their acculturation orientations, although there have been several studies of their acculturation expectations of migrant groups, and these tend towards a preference for integration, with some groups preferring assimilation, although they call it something else. It really is, in real terms, assimilation. Some years ago, we conducted a study, a small qualitative study, looking at acculturation orientations amongst multiple groups. So that included First Nations or Indigenous Australians, migrant and refugee Australians, and also majority Australians, a kind of multi-way perspective. And from our qualitative data, we found that Australian majority members didn't have much perceived need for cultural maintenance, and they acknowledged their political, cultural and economic power, or as I think Katerina has said in one of her papers, ethno-linguistic vitality. Nonetheless, they reported that they wanted to learn more about other cultures, particularly those of First Nations Australians, and they put that as a higher priority than for the cultures of more recent migrant groups. Although, in essence, apart from First Nations Australians, we're all migrants in Australia. So there appeared to be some desire to adapt to aspects of minority cultures, but this might be restricted to learning rather than adopting elements of values, beliefs, or practices. But I need to acknowledge that that was a small sample qualitative data in only 2 Australian cities. And so it was clear that there's a need for more investigation, and that's what this paper is about. So we wanted to do a quantitative study to explore majority group Australians' acculturation orientations. And here they are profiles, because we've conducted latent profile analysis on the scores. and we used the person-centered approach. And I was kind of hoping a previous paper might outline this approach, but that hasn't occurred, so I'll have to explain a little bit about it. But rather than being variable-centered, as in driven by scores on the scales, on the acculturation scales, this is data-driven, so driven by how people have responded. And we've used latent profile analysis, similar in some ways to cluster analysis. So we've looked at how people's responses have on the scales have clustered, and then we've called these or interpreted them in terms of particular acculturation profiles. We were interested to see whether in Australia we had similar patterns of acculturation profiles compared to other settler societies like the United States. And we've used a fairly, the well-known two-dimensional framework of acculturation. We've looked at cultural maintenance. In this case, we've called it national cultural maintenance, and other culture adoption, and looked at scores on those two dimensions. We had several hypotheses, but I'm going to focus on the first one in this talk today because I really don't have time to go into the others. But our main hypothesis here was really just about how the profiles might fall. And we predicted that we would find at least 3 acculturation strategies amongst majority culture Australians, based on the previous findings of other studies. And these would probably be the integrated strategy, a separated strategy, which we tend to call dominant, because we feel that reflects better the power dimension in the Australian context, and a third one, which is really kind of unclassifiable in a sense, the diffuse or undifferentiated group. Just by way of connection to some of the previous discussion, we also looked at the relationship between people's responses on the acculturation scales and measures of intercultural sensitivity and intercultural contact. And I think we can think of intercultural sensitivity as a kind of, a positive side, a bit like intergroup empathy, as opposed to threat, as was discussed earlier. But unfortunately, I won't go into those details today. Whoops. So we had 2 samples, an undergraduate student sample of about 200 students, which you can see is predominantly female identifying, and a representative community sample of about 300 people, which is much more representative for gender and age and socioeconomic status of the Australian population. The undergraduate student sample was a useful context, I suppose, or exists within a useful context, though, of a university setting where there is definitely the opportunity for intercultural interaction and contact that might prompt thoughts about how you get along with others and adopt or not aspects of other cultures. And also because of the presence of international students and international staff. But it is, of course, quite highly select in terms of socioeconomic status. And as I said, it's gender biased in this particular case. All of our participants were born in Australia and identified as having white cultural heritage, either Western European or British in most cases. And this, again, there's a lot of discussion around how we define that. That's what we've gone with for this particular study, but it's not necessarily a perfect classification. We used the Multi-Vancouver Index of Acculturation from Ryder et al. As adapted by Leffringhausen and Marshall for majority samples, and these other scales as well. So as I said before, we used the person-centered approach, where we looked at individual scores on the 2 dimensions of the multi-VIA, and using R, conducted latent profile analysis. The person-centered approach was chosen because the study was exploratory. We didn't necessarily have a predetermined idea about what we might find, and also because it's appropriate for theory building. And we tested up to a 5-profile solution. And the way the profile analysis works is it starts with a 1-profile solution which captures everyone because everybody's in the sample, and then progressively adds a profile until no further profiles add to the fit indices or lead to an improvement in the fit indices. And we tested up to 5. Nothing was really going on beyond a 5-profile solution. The fit indices are indicated there, and it's a combination of those on which you make a decision as to which is the best model. And this table gives the statistics for the model fit indices and entropy values for the student sample. And so we've highlighted here the 4th model, which has 4 profiles in it because it had the best fit. In particular, it had the best BIC and AIC in combination with the highest entropy value. So it was the best fitting model. 4 profiles, or 4 groups of acculturation orientations. And this is a kind of tricky figure to describe, but this is the scores on the 2 dimensions as they're clustered into the profiles. And this is what comes from R when you do the latent profile analysis. So we have on the left, national cultural maintenance, and on the right, other culture adoption. And I'll add the explanatory text here with enormous gratitude to Abraham Kennan, who prepared this slide and did most of the analyses. You can see that there is quite a bit of variability, and actually I should have said what's reflected in the box on the right-hand side are Z scores for each of those dimensions. So class 1 or profile 1 was characterised by low scores on cultural maintenance and also low scores on other culture adoption. And this, in an immigrant sample, we would probably call disengaged. We'd call marginalised, but we've called it disengaged here. We didn't feel that marginalised captured perhaps the dominant group's perspective, although thinking about the variability in the Australian population, particularly for socioeconomic status, marginalised might be appropriate here. It gives me a thought for a future study. The second class is a dominant group or separated under the previous kind of terminology, and that is moderate scores on national culture maintenance and low on other culture adoption. Class 3 is clearly integrated. They were moderate to high scores on both dimensions. And the 4th class we've called receptive, although in some ways it's approaching what we might call assimilation. So this has moderate to high scores on other culture adoption and a low score on national cultural maintenance. We called it receptive because we felt that the other culture adoption wasn't sufficiently high to really, or the 2 dimensions were not sufficiently differentiated in opposite directions to think of it as assimilated. These are the fit indices and entropy values for the second sample. So this is the community sample, the larger and more representative one. You can see here that the fit indices for the 4-profile model and the 5-profile model are not very different from each other. We chose the 4-profile model for parsimony and for theoretical interpretability, but really there's not a huge difference between them. So again, we have the Z scores for each of the dimensions and the clustering or profiles of the groups on the right-hand side on each of the dimensions. And the first thing that you might note here is that for other culture adoption in particular, if you look at that figure on the right, there's a lot of overlap and kind of mess. It's quite a messy picture. And that points to perhaps the fact that this grouping doesn't capture the data particularly well. Whereas the national cultural maintenance is more clear-cut in many ways. The other thing that you might note, if you look at the arrows on the left, which describe our interpretation of each of these profiles, is that the groups are quite variable in size. So class 2 and class 4 are by far the largest groups within the sample. So let's start with class 1. This is only about 4% of the group. They had high scores on national cultural maintenance and a very low score on other culture adoption. So we called them dominant, or again, we could think of them as separated. Class 2, disengaged or marginalised, they were pretty low scores on both. This is a large group, 46% of the sample. Receptive, based on our data from the student sample, we used that interpretive label again, a small group again. And even though we've used the same label and they have a kind of similar profile, this is not the same as receptive in the student sample. But they had a very low score on national cultural maintenance and a moderate score on other culture adoption, so not clearly assimilated. And I'll talk a little bit more about those national cultural maintenance scores in a minute. And then finally, diffuse or undifferentiated. This is a big group. This is 47% again of the sample. And they had kind of moderate scores in the middle, and you can see that there in the purple on both of the scales, both of the dimensions. So we had 4 or 5. I've said there's a question mark, I guess, about the 5 in the community sample profiles identified in each sample. These, if we use the the language that we've used with migrant samples and the berries model, we have a disengaged or marginalised group, a dominant or separated group, receptive and integrated, and disengaged, dominant, receptive, and a large diffuse or undifferentiated group in the community sample. In some ways, these match the patterns in other contexts from other studies, but we did have this kind of novel receptive strategy. As I said, this could be thought of as being like assimilation, but their other cultural adoption scores are not that high. What this group seems to be characterised by more than anything is a really strong rejection of national culture maintenance. So really low scores on that dimension. In terms of the relationships with intercultural sensitivity and intergroup contact, which I said I wouldn't talk about, but I will just briefly, these follow patterns that you would expect for these kinds of groups, so that the profiles that have more endorsement of other culture adoption tend to be higher in intercultural sensitivity, rate their intercultural contact more positively, and have more frequent contact. But those are correlational. We wouldn't say one necessarily is causing the other, and we couldn't say. So what can we conclude from this? As I said at the beginning, it's an exploratory study, so it's data-driven. It is nonetheless the first quantitative study of majority group acculturation in Australia, and therefore has value in what it contributes. But there are clearly some limitations. We didn't ask people to focus on a specific minority culture when we ask those questions that in the multi-VIA, and that's clearly something that needs to be done in future work. There is quite a lot of variability in people's scores, particularly in the community sample. There was a lot of variability in the community sample, and therefore we end up with quite sort of loose profiles. And it's clear that as it's interpreted, the other people might label those profiles in different ways. They do, though, I think, particularly for the community sample, make me wonder whether there is whether the two-dimensional framework is valid for majority samples because of the power, that ethnic linguistic vitality that they have. There is, of course, less impetus to adopt elements of other cultures, but also there's this interesting finding, I think, in the Australian context of this often quite strong rejection of national cultural maintenance. And this is a question that I raised because we didn't see it I haven't seen it quite so much in some of the previous work, and that is whether this national cultural maintenance is rejected because of Australians' discomfort with nationalism and patriotism, and that has historically been the case, or whether it's because our definition of majority group Australians resulted in people who are, you know, 1, 2, not many generations away from their migrant heritage, and therefore don't see themselves perhaps as majority, even though they identify in that way. So there are questions there, I guess, about that particular finding, and something that deserves further investigation. And that brings me to the end. I think I've spoken very quickly, so I've gone under time. Thank you very much.